Good morning, Professor Bielefeldt. Welcome to Leuven, and thank you very much for taking a few moments out of your busy schedule to talk to us and offer your views to the FRAME project. So we'll go ahead with a first question. You have served as the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief since 2010. So could you briefly describe to us what your mandate is, what your responsibilities are?
Okay, mandate holders are independent experts, so I'm working in the UN, but I'm not part of the UN staff, not part of the bureaucracy. The same is true for other mandate holders. I mean, we have country-specific mandate, thematic mandates like freedom of expression, violence against women, or in my case, freedom of religion or belief. So, and I would say the work mainly has three different dimensions. The first dimension is the one least known at all. It's case related. So even people working on human rights professionally often don't know that rapporteurs have a possibility to also address individual cases. By sending out diplomatic démarches. It's a confidential procedure, but in retrospect, all these exchanges are also made publicly available in order also to create an incentive for governments to respond appropriately. So case level, that's, I would say, the backbone of the mandate, because it's only at that level that the mandate can really be global. I mean, there you are in touch with developments, at least with cases, with incidents, virtually in all regions of the world, possibly in all countries of the world. Then the second level is thematic. So for instance, in a few weeks, in 2 weeks in fact, I will present my annual report to the Human Rights Council, focusing on violence committed in the name of religion. The subsequent thematic report will be to the General Assembly, so I will report that in the General Assembly also in October this year on children's rights and freedom of religion or belief, or the right of the child to freedom of religion or belief. And I could go on with examples, so the thematic dimension. And then the third dimension is country-specific. So also mandate holders who generally work on a theme, like in my case, freedom of religion or belief, of course, undertake inspections, country inspections. My last was to Vietnam, which was quite a horrific experience, I have to say that. And the next one will be in March to Lebanon, and also with a strong component of investigating the situation in refugee camps. Also freedom of religion or belief in refugee camps. Also, that will also be a thematic report then, but at the same time it has a country-specific dimension. I mean, these are mainly the three levels of work: case-related, country-specific, thematic.
Now I would like to bring the focus a little bit on what has been on the news lately. But first, I would like to just remind the audience that the UN Human Rights Council has emphasized that freedom of religion or belief and the freedom of expression are interdependent, interrelated, and mutually reinforcing, like all human rights.
Yes.
Yet the recent Charlie Hebdo events have evidenced that there is a tension between freedom of expression and freedom of religion. Notably, some people are of the opinion that certain religious beliefs are off limits because they're sacred, and they are off limits for freedom of expressions. So the question is, do you, as the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, have any concrete suggestions on how to reconcile these two human rights and how to ease those tensions?
I mean, there is a need to ease tensions, but there's no need to reconcile these norms because they are not contradicting each other. And I would say that's it's a misunderstanding. And here I'm, let's say, fully in harmony with also my colleague, the rapporteur on freedom of expression, especially his predecessor who served until quite recently. I mean, we really took a number of initiatives in tandem, in close cooperation, in order to send that message. These norms are neighboring norms, they're neighbors. I mean, literally speaking, in the UN numbers, it's 18 and 19, the Universal Declaration, 18, freedom of religion or belief, 19. You find the same neighborhood in the European Convention on Human Rights, there it's 9 and 10. In Belgium, they are even roommates, they are not even neighbors, they are in one and the same article, like also in the US in the First Amendment. And I think for good reasons. Of course, we have conflicts, there's no doubt about that, we have tensions. But I mean, these tensions are maybe tensions between conflicting human rights interests or human rights concerns. Okay, I mean, human life is complicated. Managing conflicts is the most normal daily business whenever you deal with human rights. There are always conflicts. But it's not a conflict at the level of the norms itself. So that the more you invest in freedom of expression, the more you will lose in terms of freedom of religion or the other way around. That's not true. It's not true. We have conflicts on the ground, but we have to deal with these norms by referring to all the normative standards. To deal with these conflicts by referring to all the relevant normative standards. And freedom of religion has much to do with communicative outreach. I mean, it has a close resemblance to freedom of expression. I mean, it's about people's identity-shaping convictions, but also the right to express these convictions, to manifest these convictions, to reach out towards others, to communicate, to induce them maybe also to reconsider their own thoughts. It's not only a right of believers in a traditional understanding, it's also a right to which non-believers can refer. I mean, for some people that may be an element of surprise. It also protects atheists, agnostics, critics, skeptics. I mean, one source of that usual or quite typical misunderstanding that you also alluded to is that people wrongly assume, that freedom of religion or belief protects religions. It does not protect religions. It protects human beings. I mean, human beings are the only right holders in the framework of human rights. The only right holders. So, and in this case, it protects human beings in that broad area of religion or belief. So, human beings in all their different convictions, but also maybe their critical convictions, also maybe in their alternative interpretations of religious sources, and also in some people's claims of leave me alone with all of this. Yeah. So I mean, by focusing on the human being as right holder, you will finally see these norms are very close. They are very close. Which, of course, does not mean that we have a total harmony on the ground. No, I mean, obviously not. I mean, but as I said, that's a daily practice in human rights anyway. I mean, managing conflicts.
So you do not think it is right for a state, for example, to restrict some right holders' right to the freedom of expression for the benefits of certain perceived interests of other rights holders of freedom of religion with blasphemy laws?
Blasphemy laws, no. Blasphemy laws, no. And blasphemy laws are not only in violation of freedom of expression, they're also in violation of freedom of religion. Because you can see that. I mean, we have lots of evidence. Look at Saudi Arabia, look at Pakistan, look at India. I mean, this is not something only happening in the Islamic world. Look also at in Russia is more or less playing that game. Wherever you have blasphemy laws, it has an intimidating effect on also religious minorities, religious dissidents. So it's in the interest also not only of freedom of expression, but also of freedom of religion or belief, to urge states to repeal blasphemy laws. Yeah. I was always very clear on that, but the same was true for my predecessor, Asma Jahangir from Pakistan, stemming from Pakistan herself. She also spoke very clearly against the blasphemy laws in her own country, but also worldwide. And that has always been the practice of the mandate holders on freedom of religion or belief. So you see, when it comes to this specific issue, we have exactly the same interest, maybe from slightly different angles, remove blasphemy laws. You can also find that let me briefly take the opportunity to mention one of my favorite action plans. It's the Rabat Plan of Action of October 2012, elaborated under the auspices of the Office of the High Commissioner. And that is an action plan about how to deal with incitement to hatred, or to acts of hatred, not only hate speech. And the main message is repeal blasphemy laws. Make positive use of freedom of expression. By the way, I mean, none of these rights is absolute. I mean, freedom of expression can be limited, but there are criteria and the threshold must be very high. It cannot be limited in the interest of blasphemy laws. it can be limited in the interest of people who need to be protected against incitement to commit in acts of hatred, acts of violence. I mean, there are limits drawn both to freedom of expression as well freedom of religion. I believe none of these rights is per se beyond any possible restrictions. But the criteria that states have to observe and to meet cumulatively, all these criteria, I mean, they set a rather high threshold for restrictions. Again, and by the way, also the logic of defining the criteria for legitimate restrictions are very, almost identical in both rights, freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief.
Well, thank you. This was very interesting, and I noted that you outlined the role of states and public authorities in reaching the right balance between and the harmonious exercise of both rights. So, as you know, we are a research project focused on how the EU can promote human rights, and so I would like to ask you a question about the EU now. What has been the response of the EU to your mandate and findings? As the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, how do you envisage the role of the European Union in protecting and promoting those fundamental rights?
Yes, I mean, of course, I experience a lot of commitment of the EU as a whole, but also of the EU member states. So just 3 days ago, I participated in a meeting of the OSCE in the Vienna Hofburg, a meeting on the humanitarian dimension, and the topic was freedom of religion or belief. After my speech, the first person to take the floor was Latvia in the name of the EU. Next week, I will meet with EU representatives in Geneva. The subsequent week, we will have a joint event, a so-called side event, but organized by the EU on the issue of violence committed in the name of religion. So, I mean, there is a direct encounter, and I mean, the EU certainly supports my mandate. I'm grateful for that support. The EU also supports that mandate on the understanding that it's closely related to other mandates, in particular freedom of expression. So we have the same general viewpoint. I mean, at a totally different level, let me also mention that from time to time, I've been invited also to speak in EU institutions, in the EU Parliament. Of course, I've been in touch with the intergroup, now the working group on freedom of religion or belief, established by Dennis de Jong and Peter van Dalen, so also a cross-party endeavor. I've been in touch with the External Action Service, and of course I attach great importance to the EU guidelines on freedom of religion or belief. So a foreign policy, external service instrument trying to make use of the existing infrastructure in terms of consulate, embassies, to protect people under threat. For instance, by inviting them to conference, by showing an interest, by reporting on a regular basis, by using contacts in those countries to promote freedom of religion or belief, and also to provide very practical protection for people in need of such protection. There's an enormous potential, and I'm looking forward also to evaluations. I mean, that is now a next step, that the guidelines that have been existed now since almost 2 years need to be evaluated. I think this is also planned for this year, for 2015, to see how efficiently they are used in practice.
Okay. Well, thank you. I have a final question. You are an academic, and we are an academic research project on the role of the EU in the field of human rights. So I would like you to give us maybe a little bit of advice, a little bit of inspiration as to what the role of academia and of research is in achieving better protection for fundamental rights, and notably the freedom of religion or belief.
Yes, I mean, freedom of religion or belief is a fascinating subject, and I think it requires interdisciplinary research. You cannot approach that from a purely legal perspective. Of course, law is important, the legal norms, the legal institutions, but you also need to have a sort of educated ear for religion, so one has to be musical and to a certain degree, which is not the same thing like sharing these beliefs, but understanding the existential dimensions at stake in many of the claims. It's good to also to have a broad account of history, sometimes our understanding of the genesis of human rights in general, also freedom of religion or belief, is too narrowly Eurocentric. I think there are worlds to discover. In order also to broaden ownership, to broaden commitment, to encourage people. So it would be good to do more research in history, philosophy, but also education, but to do it jointly, so interdisciplinary projects. What I can say from my experience in the UN is I don't see enough overlap between the academic world and the UN. So I'm currently doing both. Rapporteurs as independent experts don't receive money in the UN, so I still have my job at the university. But it's really working in two worlds, which we don't connect much. I mean, of course, they do connect somehow. In the UN, I would say the only discipline that really matters is international law. I mean, you see a lot of lawyers working there, so the legal expertise is very much present. Much less political science, even much less sociology, anthropology, history, philosophy, and I mean, what a waste! I mean, if at the same time, I'm of course I'm experienced at the university as a system in which a lot of experimentation can be done, and that's exactly the idea. People should be free to experiment intellectually without always being driven by practical interests. Okay, I mean, that distance is, I think, generally healthy. But at the same time, I'm wondering, whether it wouldn't be possible to also concentrate more on burning issues. So some of the research that I see in universities, including my own universities, really strikes me as l'art pour l'art. And I mean, that's the way universities are supposed to function, okay. But maybe nonetheless one can move beyond that l'art pour l'art and try to identify the really burning issues. There are so many burning issues. So I would actually like to see more interaction also between the political human rights world and the academic disciplines that could have an impact, and I would still currently having a very limited impact.